The first time my parents forgot my birthday, they apologized. The second time, they laughed it off. By the third year, they had turned it into something so small and familiar that I started feeling embarrassed for still being hurt by it. That was the clever part, not the forgetting. The way they trained me to feel childish for noticing. Because once a family convinces you that your pain is too minor to count, they can repeat it forever and still think of themselves as good people. My name is Claire Whitmore, and for 10 consecutive years, my parents remembered my brother's milestones, my cousin's graduations, church potlucks, neighborhood anniversaries, dog birthdays, retirement dinners, and every holiday that looked good in photographs. But my birthday, the one day each year that should have reminded them I existed as something separate from chores, convenience, and family utility, kept passing like weather. And the year they finally remembered, I was no longer in America. If this story hits something old in you, subscribe now. Some betrayals do not arrive as violence. They arrive as absence, repeated until it becomes identity. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, in a beige 2-story house with dark shutters, creaky hardwood stairs, and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of coffee, dish soap, and whatever my mother had cooked 3 hours earlier. From the outside, we looked stable. Seasonal wreath, trimmed lawn, respectable mailbox, the kind of family neighbors described as solid, the kind of family churchwomen called blessed because nobody ever heard shouting through the walls. Inside, we specialized in quiet hierarchy. My mother, Elaine, was efficient in the way certain women become efficient after years of mistaking control for love. She never looked rushed. She managed schedules in a planner with color tabs and tiny, precise handwriting. She remembered dentist appointments, grocery cycles, choir rehearsals, and every obligation that helped her feel indispensable. She also had a gift for forgetting anything that belonged only to me unless it benefited her image to remember it. My father, Paul, sold commercial insurance and had one of those agreeable faces that made strangers trust him faster than they should have. At home, he functioned mostly as emotional weatherproofing for my mother. He smoothed over discomfort, softened conflicts, and called it peacekeeping. He was not a cruel man. He was worse in a quieter way. He was a man who believed silence during unfairness still counted as love if his tone stayed gentle enough. Then there was my younger brother, Nathan. Nathan was not evil. That matters. Too many family stories get flattened into saints and villains because people find that easier to digest. Nathan was simply the child my parents found easier to love visibly. He was bright in the social way, funny without trying, athletic enough for other adults to mention it, and careless with time in a way our mother described as free-spirited instead of inconsiderate. He forgot homework and got grace. He forgot chores and got reminders. He forgot to call our grandmother back, and our mother said he had a lot on his mind. If I forgot anything, it was evidence of a character flaw. That was our split. He got innocence. I got responsibility. I was the older child, the reliable one, the one who remembered library books, signed permission slips, refilled the Brita pitcher, noticed when the dog needed medicine, and carried the invisible weight families always hand to the child, least likely to drop it publicly. People like to praise girls like that. They call us mature, helpful, strong. What they mean is convenient. The first birthday I remember being forgotten was my 13th, not because earlier ones had been perfect, but because 13 is old enough for the hurt to become conscious and young enough that you still think calling attention to it might fix something. It was a Tuesday in March. Raine. Gray. My mother was distracted because Nathan had a school basketball banquet that evening. My father had a client dinner. I came home from school with 2 cards in my backpack from friends. A cheap cupcake in a plastic container from the cafeteria because my best friend Leah had insisted, and a hopeful, humiliating little expectation that maybe there would be dinner waiting or candles, or at least one moment where someone in my house would say my name like the day belonged to me. Instead, my mother was on the phone in the kitchen discussing banquet seating with another parent. Nathan was complaining about his tie. My father was changing upstairs. The house smelled like rain-damp laundry and spaghetti sauce. I stood there with my backpack still on and waited. Nobody said anything. Not hello birthday girl. Not happy 13. Nothing. At first I thought they were pretending, that there would be a reveal. So I waited through dinner. Waited while Nathan talked about a teammate's scoring average. Waited while my mother reminded him to keep his napkin in his lap because photographs might be taken later. Waited while my father checked email between bites. At 6:40 they left for the banquet. I stayed home because family attendance wasn't necessary for every event. The second their car backed out of the driveway, I went upstairs, shut my bedroom door, and cried into the sleeve of a sweatshirt because I still had not learned that humiliation gets louder once you name it. They came home at 10:15 carrying a banquet centerpiece and leftover bread rolls. My mother opened my door without knocking, saw my face, and said, "Oh my God." Those words should have felt like recognition. Instead, they felt like accusation. "What?" she asked. I just looked at her. Her expression shifted. Then she said, "Claire, was today your birthday?" That sentence changed something permanent in me. Not because of the forgetting, because of the wording. Was today your birthday? As if my existence were trivia. As if the date had been a small clerical oversight rather than the one day that should have required no reminder at all. My father appeared behind her then. Looked startled. Then guilty. Then instantly too gentle, which was always his version of retreat. "Oh, honey," he said, "we're so sorry." Nathan, from the hallway, asked, "Wait, really?" My mother started talking fast. "We've been so busy. This week's been insane. You know how much we've had on our plate. We'll celebrate this weekend." That was the first apology. The first reset. The first time I accepted a replacement because I still thought the original mattered enough to restore. They got me a cake on Saturday. Store-bought. Vanilla. My father handed me an envelope with $20, and my mother said, "See, we fixed it." That line did more damage than the forgetting the. Because in our house, once a practical patch had been applied, emotional consequences became impolite. The second year, they forgot again. This time, my mother blamed the calendar because she had been sure it was next week. My father laughed awkwardly and said, "Well, I guess you don't age this year." Nathan was leaving for a school trip that morning, and the entire kitchen had been devoted to his snacks. Charger cords, permission forms, and dramatic insistence that he would absolutely starve without the right granola bars. I stood there in a clean sweater, already regretting existing inside my own hope, and said, lightly because by then I had learned to disguise the wound if I wanted any chance of kindness. It's okay. That is another lesson daughters like me learn too young. How to make other people comfortable while they are disappointing us. The third year, I didn't wait. That was new. I woke up already braced. The air in my room was cold. The house quiet, except for the water pipes, knocking faintly somewhere inside the walls. I lay there staring at the ceiling and realized I had already built a defense before breakfast. Maybe if I expect nothing. I thought, nothing can humiliate me. That sounds mature when adults say versions of it. In children, it is just grief becoming efficient. That morning, my mother asked me to take chicken out of the freezer before school. My father left early for a breakfast meeting. Nathan had a history test and was in a foul mood because he'd stayed up too late on his phone. No one said a word. Betrayal. I knew. And by 6, when my mother asked if I could help frost cupcakes for a church bake sale because you're always so neat with detail, I laughed. Not loudly. Just once. She looked at me sharply. What? I set down the spatula. Nothing. I said, it's just funny that you remembered the bake sale. Silence. Then the tiniest tightening around her mouth. My mother hated being observed while wrong. She recovered quickly. If you're going to be moody, she said, you can go upstairs. Moede. That was the reframe. Not forgotten. Not hurt. Moede. I went upstairs anyway. That night, long after everyone was asleep, my father tapped on my bedroom door and came in carrying a mug of hot chocolate like a man, hoping sugar might do the emotional work of courage. I know today wasn't what it should have been, he said. That sentence stays with me because even then he could not say birthday directly. He set the mug on my desk and sat on the edge of my chair. We'll do better. I remember looking at him in the dim light from my bedside lamp and realizing something that took years to phrase cleanly. Men like my father always promise a future version of fairness because confronting the present version of cowardice would cost them too much. He meant it. That almost made it worse. Because sincerity without action trains children to confuse intention with safety. The 4th year, Nathan had a regional soccer final. The 5th, my mother was coordinating a church fundraiser. The 6th, my father was traveling. The 7th, my birthday fell during a week when my cousin Jenna was staying with us after her parents' divorce. Temporarily, which in family language means indefinitely until someone else absorbs the burden without making it inconvenient. Every year had a reason. That was how they protected themselves. There is always a reason when people want to think well of themselves. They were tired. Bozu. Distracted. Stressed. And because the neglect was clean, contained, and only once a year, nobody around us would have called it abuse. That's why it worked. Spectacular cruelty alarms the conscience. Routine neglect just teaches the victim to sound oversensitive when she tells it back later. The 8th year, something changed. I was 20, home from college for spring break. And for the first time, my best friend Leah saw it happen in real time. Leah had driven down from Chapel Hill with me because she didn't want to spend the entire break with her own family, who loved each other loudly and broke each other loudly and exhausted her in ways she could at least name. She arrived at our house expecting a restful few days. That morning, she hugged me in the driveway and said, "So what's the birthday plan?" I laughed before I could stop myself. "What?" "The dinner. Cake? Anything?" Her face changed when she saw mine. "Oh?" she said. Then, "No." She thought I meant I wanted something low-key. I didn't correct her. Because how do you explain to an outsider that your family has made forgetting you feel normal enough that you're embarrassed by their ignorance, instead of the neglect itself? That evening, Leah sat at our table while my mother discussed Nathan's upcoming summer program. My father talked about a new client. And nobody said my name in relation to the date. Leah kept glancing at me with this mixture of shock and restraint that made me want to leave my own skin. When we finally got upstairs, she shut the guest room door and said, "Claire." "What the hell?" I sat on the bed and pulled off my earrings too carefully. "It's not a big deal." She stared at me. "That sentence means it is a big deal." I remember the room exactly. The smell of her citrus shampoo, the hum of the vent, the way the cheap guest room lamp made everything look flatter than it was. "It happens." I said, "How many times?" I looked down. "Too long." Her face went white. "How many times?" "Most years." She sat down beside me slowly. "Your parents forgot your birthday most years?" I shrugged. There it was again. The body trying to minimize what the mouth didn't want to admit. And then Leah said something I had apparently needed someone from outside the system to say aloud. "That's not normal." I cried harder that night than I had at 13. Not because of the forgetting, because somebody had finally removed the family language from it. Not busy, not oversight, not a mix-up, not moodiness, not one of those things. Not normal. That sentence became a splinter in me. Useful, painful, impossible to ignore once it lodged there. After college, I moved to Charlotte for work. I got a junior role in nonprofit fundraising operations, unglamorous spreadsheets, donor tracking, event logistics, reporting, grand prep. I liked it. Not because it was dreamy work, because it rewarded consistency, because numbers did not pretend, because databases do not tell you they forgot by accident when the pattern is 10 years old. I got my own apartment with thin walls, a tiny balcony, and kitchen cabinets painted over too many times. I learned the rhythm of my own life. Grocery lists, rent, coworkers, coffee shops where the baristas started recognizing me, the relief of being out from under family weather. And somewhere inside that steadier life, Imed Daniel. His name still catches in my chest when I say it sometimes. Not because of unresolved pain, but because some names retain the shape of rescue long after they stop being dramatic. We met at a donor gala setup, both of us carrying folding signage and silently judging a consultant who kept using the phrase guest journey as if human beings were a retail floor plan. He was tall, warm-voiced, dark-haired, with the sort of composure that makes you curious instead of dazzled. He worked in international education consulting, which sounded both impossible and underpaid, and made me laugh in the exact places I had stopped expecting laughter to find me. He liked practical things, well-made shoes, train schedules, quiet restaurants, maps. He remembered details without making a show of it. The first year we were together, he asked me what I wanted for my birthday 2 weeks in advance. That question alone almost broke me. Not because it was romantic, because it was normal. I remember standing in his kitchen while he chopped basil and realizing that some of the grief I carried was not grief over what my parents had done, but grief over how long I had accepted starvation as a manageable diet. Daniel didn't try to fix that. He just never participated in it. He remembered dates. Sent flowers to my office once. Not expensive ones. Just tulips, and a card that said, "I'm glad the day exists because you do." I cried in the supply closet. That's what happens when ordinary care arrives in a body trained to brace for absence. The 9th year, my parents forgot my birthday. I was 26 and already living in Charlotte full-time. My mother called 2 days later to ask if I was free to host Aunt Linda and Uncle Gene for lunch the next weekend, because your apartment is more central. I almost admired the confidence. Almost. "Mom," I said, "did you realize you missed my birthday?" Silence. Then the sigh. That sigh. The one that means she is positioning herself as the burdened adult dealing with a disappointing emotional request from someone less evolved. "Oh, Claire, I was going to call." "No, you weren't." That was the first time I had ever said something that direct to her. The line went so still I could hear my own pulse. She recovered quickly. "Of course. I don't know why you're talking to me like this." Because accurate daughters always become disrespectful the moment they stop performing gratitude for neglect. "You forgot," I said, again. "We have had a lot going on." There it was. The sentence that had carried them through almost a decade. I looked out my apartment window at a parking lot shining with late afternoon heat and said, more calmly than I felt, "You have had a lot going on for 10 years. That number landed. She knew it landed. And instead of apologizing, she shifted to offense. "If you're going to keep score over something this petty, I don't know how to help you." Petty. That word did almost as much damage as the forgetting. Not because I believed it anymore. Because I recognized it as a strategy. Petty is what people call your pain when they need to minimize the evidence of their pattern. We hung up badly. My father texted later that evening, "Your mother didn't mean to upset you." That was his whole emotional range in one sentence. Translation: deflection. No accountability. No direct acknowledgement. Just the old invitation to step back into the family role where my job was to metabolize whatever had been done and reassure everyone else they were still decent people. I didn't answer. By the 10th year, I stopped waiting altogether. That sounds stronger than it felt? Really, it was just exhaustion becoming efficient. I told Daniel I wanted dinner out. And I booked it myself, because by then I had learned that taking charge of my own joy was less humiliating than leaving a vacancy where other people had proved they would not show up. That morning, my phone stayed quiet. No mother. No father. No Nathan, who by then worked in real estate and posted gym selfies. Engagement photo. And photos of his expensive steaks, with more consistency than he ever contacted me. Around noon, Leah texted before I could even think about them. "Happy birthday. Still alive? Still hot? Still better than all of them?" I laughed so hard. I startled a coworker. Daniel sent flowers to the office again. Then dinner. Then a small wrapped box with a fountain pen inside, because he had once heard me and complain that every good pen disappeared around development staff. And sometime around 11 that night, while washing my face, I looked at myself in the mirror, and realized something quietly devastating. The forgetting no longer shocked me. It had simply become part of the architecture. That was the moment I understood. I had to leave more than my city if I wanted a different version of myself. Not because distance is magical, because some patterns only stay alive if the geography keeps cooperating. I hadn't planned on leaving the country. Not seriously. I had daydreamed about it in the abstract. The way a lot of tired women daydream about dramatic geography, when what they really want is relief from the version of themselves that keeps getting reactivated in familiar rooms. Then Daniel got an offer. Not vague. Real. A position in Amsterdam with an international education firm expanding operations across Europe. Good salary. Relocation support. 3-year contract with strong long-term potential. He told me over Thai takeout at my kitchen table on a Thursday night, while rain ticked against the windows. I haven't answered yet, he said. I stared at him. And if I do this, I want it to be because we're doing it. That sentence was so clean it almost hurt. Not because it was pressure, because it was the opposite. No assumption. No entitlement. Just invitation. We spent 3 months deciding what would happen with my work. Whether I could pivot to a remote development operations role. What it would mean to move away from Leah. From Charlotte. From everything I had built. And underneath all the practical questions was one quieter truth I only admitted to myself late in the process. There was something seductive about leaving a country where my family still had access to my shape, where they could call at the wrong time, show up at the wrong event, forward my address to people I did not want to manage, accidentally on purpose remind me that they still held a version of me in their files. Amsterdam was not an act of revenge. Not at first. It was an act of oxygen. So we moved. We moved in late August. Amsterdam greeted us with gray skies, bicycle bells, canal water, narrow buildings leaning toward one another, like old women sharing opinions, and an air that smelled like rain, coffee, bread, and stone. Everything felt older than my family, and kinder than my nervous system knew what to do with at first. Our apartment was on the 3rd floor of a narrow building with windows that opened over a canal, and stairs so steep they felt more like a dare than architecture. The kitchen was tiny. The ceilings were high. The radiator hissed at night. Church bells drifted in on Sundays. Bicycles moved past below from dawn to midnight. And for the first several weeks, I kept stopping at the window just to watch ordinary people pass through a life that did not know my family's version of me. That mattered more than I expected. Starting over in another country sounds glamorous when people say it quickly. In real life, it is mostly paperwork, grocery confusion, adaptation fatigue, and the low-grade emotional disorientation of realizing your body still expects old triggers even when the geography no longer contains them. I had to learn tram routes, grocery labels, tax forms, new work rhythms, and how to be lonely in a way that didn't immediately feel like abandonment. But there was also relief. Enormous, quiet relief. No chance of running into someone from church in a Target aisle. No accidental family drop-bys. No women who had once believed I was difficult now asking whether I was still close with your parents in the careful, hungry tone people use when they suspect a wound might still be conversationally useful. I still spoke to Leah. Of course. Still texted occasionally with Nathan in the shallow, performative sibling way that kept things technically alive without ever becoming real. Still heard from my father on major holidays in messages so generic they could have been copied from a customer relations template. Thinking of you at Christmas. Hope you're both well. Tell Daniel hello. No mention of birthdays. Not once. My mother did not contact me for almost 8 months after the move. That was not unusual. Silence was her preferred medium whenever she thought withholding access might still function as moral authority. If she couldn't control the shape of the relationship, she often retreated into absence and waited for guilt to do the rest. The difference now was that guilt had trouble traveling as far as Amsterdam. Distance changes shame. Not because it heals you automatically, because it interrupts repetition. Without the same roads, same rooms, same holidays, same old neighbors, same family choreography. Some hurts finally lose the props they needed to keep performing themselves. Daniel noticed it before I did. One Saturday morning in November, we were in a tiny market buying pears and flowers and bread, still warm enough to fog the paper bag. And I laughed at something stupid he said about Dutch mayonnaise policies. He looked at me for a second too long, then smiled and said, "There you are." I laughed again. Where was I? He shifted the flower stems in his hand. Still back there. A little. That sentence sat in me all day. Because it was true. I had moved countries before all of me had caught up. Some part of my nervous system was still waiting for my mother's disapproval to arrive with the force of weather. Still bracing for my father's softening texts after her sharper silences. Still carrying birthdays inside me like small annual funerals, I was expected to handle alone and neatly. The first birthday I spent in Amsterdam should have been uncomplicated. That was what I told myself. I didn't want to make it meaningful. I didn't want to imbue it with pressure. I just wanted one normal day in a city where my name had no inherited baggage. Daniel took me to dinner at a candlelit restaurant near the Jordan. Leah had a cupcake delivered through some internet miracle that made me laugh until I cried. My coworkers left a card on my desk. I spent the morning walking by the canal with cold air in my lungs and the strange, fragile feeling that maybe a date could become just a date again, if it was not constantly forced to carry old evidence. Then at 4:12 p.m., my phone lit up. Mom! I stared at the screen long enough for it to stop ringing. Then it rang again. Then a text. Call me now. No hello. No happy birthday. No warmth. Command first. I knew, even before I listened to the voicemail, that something had happened she considered more important than whatever day it was. Her message proved it. Claire, call me immediately. Your father's sister says you moved to Europe, and I need to know why I'm hearing this from Linda instead of you. That was it. Not are you safe? Not how are you settling in? Not even the decency of pretending concern. Just outrage at an information hierarchy violation. I played it once on the bridge outside the restaurant, while bicycles slid past in the dark and the canal lights shook in the water. Then I deleted it. Daniel asked if I was okay. I said yes. That was not true. But it was more true than it would have been a year earlier. Because the pain was cleaner now. Less tangled in hope. I did not call her back. She texted 3 more times that night. Then my father called the next morning. His voice sounded strained. Your mother was surprised. I stood at the kitchen counter in socks, holding a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, and said, was she also aware it was my birthday? Silence. Then the familiar sigh. That sigh. The one that had carried half my life like bad wallpaper. You know how things get? No. I said quietly. I know exactly how things get. He tried again. You could have told us you were leaving. I laughed then. Not because it was funny. Because the sentence was so nakedly absurd. You forgot my birthday 10 years in a row. I said, but I'm supposed to file international relocation notices with the family office? That landed. He knew it landed. And then, like always, he reached for the middle. This isn't helping. That sentence tells you everything you need to know about men like my father. Helping whom? Not me. Never me. Helping the atmosphere. Helping appearances. Helping the fiction that everyone involved was still basically decent if we all used softer language. I looked out at the canal and said, I didn't move to punish you. He waited. I let him. I moved because I was tired of being visible only when my choices inconvenienced Mom. That was the first fully honest thing I had ever said to him about our family without cushioning the floor first. He said my name in that warning soft way I hated. Claire. No. I said, you don't get to do that tone with me anymore. We hung up badly. But for once, badly did not follow me all day like weather. It passed through. That was new. That spring, Nathan got engaged. His fiancée, Mallory, was blonde and polished and worked in dental office management and had one of those faces people trust instantly because she has built her whole life around making effort look effortless. I knew almost nothing about her, except that my mother loved her immediately, which in our family was either a blessing or a structural warning depending on what kind of woman you were. The engagement photos arrived in the family group chat with champagne. Sunset. And my mother's ecstatic commentary. My future daughter, so blessed. The Lord is good. I muted the thread. Not because it hurt. Because it bored me. That was another change I had not known to pray for. Not just less pain. Less interest. Distance had started doing what arguments never could. It had lowered the emotional volume of people who once occupied my full interior landscape. Nathan texted separately and asked if we'd be able to come home for the wedding the following year. I stared at the message longer than necessary. Then typed back. Too early to know. Congrats. That was enough. He didn't deserve more intimacy than he had ever been willing to offer me. Life in Amsterdam kept expanding. I got a remote role with a European education nonprofit, doing development operations and institutional partnerships. The work was messy and rewarding, and full of people who used the phrase donor ecosystem far too often. But it paid well enough and challenged me in the exact ways I liked systems. Communication. Coordination. Structure. Meaning. Daniel's work deepened too. We built routines, found our grocery store, argued about curtains, learned where to get the good coffee, made friends slowly, became local enough to have favorite corners. That was the life my parents had never imagined for me. Not because it was extraordinary, because it existed beyond their frame. And that seemed to matter more to them than whether I was happy. The year they finally remembered my birthday began, fittingly, with someone else's crisis. Nathan's wedding was set for late May in Raleigh. And by March, the family machine was fully activated. My mother's messages in the group chat came daily. Seating concerns, catering anxieties, Mallory's shower colors, who was flying in, which cousin couldn't sit near which aunt because of some feud I had forgotten and did not miss. Then, a week before my birthday, Nathan called unexpectedly. I almost didn't answer. He sounded stressed, not reflective. stressed. "Hey," he said, "can I ask you something weird?" "You usually do." A tired laugh. "Did Mom tell you she wants to do some family thing for your birthday this year?" I went still. "What?" He exhaled. "She keeps saying you'll probably be emotional because this is the first time in years she's trying." The room around me sharpened. The apartment smelled like rain and laundry detergent, and the soup I had left simmering too long while working. Outside, a tram bell clanged faintly. "She's trying what?" "A birthday lunch. While you're here for the wedding?" I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "I'm not there for the wedding yet." "She assumed you'd come early." That made me laugh. Of course she did. Of course, the first year she planned to remember would be built around someone else's event. Someone else's convenience. Someone else's schedule. Not my day. The wedding week. Nathan's atmosphere. My mother's opportunity to stage repair on a timeline she could photograph. "Did she tell you she forgot for 10 years?" I asked. Silence. That one landed too. Then Nathan said, more carefully, "Look, I know things haven't been perfect." That phrase, haven't been perfect. Men who have been lightly favored their whole lives always describe other people's deep wounds in cosmetic language. I cut him off. "No," I said, "things haven't been accidental." He got quiet. Then, because he had never been trained to stay in discomfort if there was any exit available, he said, "I just thought you should know." I thanked him and hung up. For the next hour, I paced the apartment with my phone in my hand and a feeling in my chest that took time to name properly. It was not hope. That would have been more dangerous. It was insult. Because remembering at year 11 is not healing. Remembering when a wedding already requires my attendance. When your future daughter-in-law needs the family image polished. When your friends and extended relatives might notice if you skip over me too. Obviously, that is not remembrance. That is brand management. Daniel came home to find me standing by the window in my coat but not leaving. He looked at my face and asked nothing performative. "Who called?" "Nathan." "And?" I told him. Every piece. The planned lunch. The timing. My mother's language. His expression did not change much. It rarely did when he was most angry. Then he said, "Do you want to go?" That question again. That mercy. Not what do you think you should do. Not family is complicated. Not maybe this is the olive branch. What do you want? I looked at the canal. At cyclists moving through rain. At a life my parents still barely understood because understanding it would require admitting I had built one successfully without their involvement. "No," I said. Then, after a pause, "But I think I want them to know why." That distinction mattered. Not reconciliation. Witness. I wrote the email the next morning. Not at night. Not in tears. Not after a glass of wine. Morning light. Coffee. Windows open to cold air. No music. No drama. Just clarity. I addressed it to my parents and copied Nathan. I wrote that I would not be coming early for a birthday lunch staged during someone else's wedding week after a decade of being forgotten. I wrote that remembering now did not erase the years when my birthday passed as an inconvenience inside their house. I wrote that neglect repeated becomes identity. And I had spent too long undoing what their pattern taught me about my place in the family. I wrote that I loved Nathan enough not to complicate his wedding, which was exactly why I would arrive only when necessary and leave immediately after. I wrote that if my mother truly wanted a relationship with me, it would begin not with one symbolic lunch, but with the truth spoken plainly. You forgot me. Repeatedly. And it mattered. Then I added the sentence that changed the room before I even entered it. By the time you finally decided to remember, I had already built a life in another country where forgetting me was no longer the center of my identity. I reread it twice. Then I sent it. My mother replied 43 minutes later. That alone told me I had hit somewhere real. Her email was long. Hurt. Indigno. And full of all the phrases women like her reach for when reality corners them. I had no idea you were keeping score like this. We were doing our best. Families go through seasons. You have always been unusually sensitive about perceived slights. This was meant as a peace offering. Your absence has affected us more than you realize. Perceived slights. There it was. A decade in 2 words. My father sent a separate email an hour later. Your mother is hurting. I think everyone has regrets. Maybe this can be a turning point, if we all approach it with grace. That one was almost more offensive. Grace. From him, had always meant absorbing harm neatly enough that no one had to change. I did not reply to either email. Nathan called that night and sounded, for the first time in our adult lives, genuinely uncomfortable on my behalf. She's really upset. I sat cross-legged on the couch with my laptop still open and said, I was really 13. Silence. Then, yeah. That one word changed him slightly in my mind. Not enough to heal anything. Enough to suggest a crack. I said I would still come to the wedding. He thanked me with the strange gratitude of a man who had spent most of his life on the easy side of a family hierarchy and was only now discovering what the other side had cost. When Daniel and I landed in Raleigh in May, the air hit me first humid. Varm. Carrying cut grass. Old pollen. Jet fuel. And memory. North Carolina has a scent that gets under your ribs if you grew up there. The moment we got into the rental car, I felt old versions of myself start moving around in my body like furniture being dragged upstairs. That is the thing about going home after distance. Growth doesn't erase original architecture. It just teaches you what not to mistake for destiny. We checked into a hotel downtown instead of staying with my parents. That decision alone caused a small storm. My mother texted 3 times asking if there was some problem with the guest room. I wrote back, no, this works better for us. For us? That phrase mattered. It put Daniel and me in the same sentence as a family unit she did not control. The rehearsal dinner was the first time I had seen my parents in nearly 2 years. The restaurant was one of those renovated southern places with dim Edison bulbs. Reclaimed wood. White plates too large for the portions. And servers, who said y'all as part of premium hospitality, instead of regional habit. The air smelled like bourbon. Rosemary. Grilled meat. And air conditioning fighting humidity. I saw my mother before she saw me. That gave me 1 full second to study her without being pulled back into the old role of daughter first. She looked older. Of course she did. But also smaller in some way I had never seen when I lived nearby. Not physically. Narratively. As if distance had shrunk the radius of her certainty. When she turned and spotted me, she smiled too fast. Then her eyes moved over my dress. My hair? Daniel's hand at my back. The fact that I seemed not only intact, but distinctly unruined by her version of events. That was the first shock. Not that I had come, that I looked like someone who no longer needed the room. Claire, she said, in the tone people use when they want witnesses to hear warmth. There was no hug. Not at first. She paused. Maybe because she was no longer sure of the price of touch. Then she stepped in lightly and kissed the air near my cheek. It's so good to see you. That sentence might have meant something once. Now it just sounded expensive. My father hugged me properly. Too long. The kind of hug men give when they are trying to make physical contact do the work of years of moral ambiguity. Nathan looked relieved I had actually arrived. Mallory was sweet. Nervous. Perfectly lovely. And so clearly not the point that I softened toward her immediately. None of this was her fault. That mattered. Dinner moved in the usual wedding eve ways. Speeches, jokes, glasses clinking. My mother laughing too brightly whenever anyone from church mentioned how exciting it must be to have me all the way from Europe. She said Europe the way some women say exile when they are trying to sound cosmopolitan. At one point, one of her friends turned to me and said, "Your mother has missed you so much." My mother tilted her head modestly. There are moments when a room decides for you whether silence would be self-protection or self-erasure. This was one of them. I smiled. Not warmly. Not coldly. Just accurately. I think what she's missed, I said, is the version of me that lived close enough to misunderstand easily. You could feel the table shift. Tiny. Electric. My mother's smile held. Barely. Her friend laughed uncertainly and looked down at her wine. My father reached for water. Nathan stared at his plate. Daniel, beside me, said nothing. That mattered most. He never rescued me from truths I had finally earned the nerve to speak. Later that night, back in the hotel room with city light coming thin through the curtains, Daniel asked if I regretted coming. I thought about it, then said, "No." And for the first time in my life, that was completely true. The wedding itself was beautiful. That also matters. Not every story needs another woman's happiness to become collateral for your pain. Mallory looked radiant. Nathan cried during the vows in a way that was surprisingly sincere. The flowers were too large. The weather held. And my mother got the photographs. She had probably been storyboarding in her head for months. I participated carefully, kindly, at a distance. The morning after the wedding, my father texted, "Can you come by the house before you leave? Just us." That line told me immediately it would not be just us. I almost said no. Then I realized there was still one thing I wanted. Not apology. Not repair. A clean final conversation on ground that had once shaped me. So Daniel drove me. The house looked smaller than memory, but smelled exactly the same coffee. Lemon cleaner. Wood polish. And old family weather. Some wounds lose force when you return. Others regain it by scent alone. My mother was in the kitchen. Of course she was. Post-wedding leftovers in containers. Flowers from the reception already being redistributed. She was never more comfortable than when managing evidence of her own usefulness. My father sat at the table. Nathan was there too. So much for just us. Fine. One room. Better. My mother began before I sat down. "I think the way you spoke to me this weekend was deeply unkind." There it was. Not I read your email 3 times and cried. Not I didn't realize how bad it had been. Just tone policing as opening statement. I set my bag down on the chair beside me and said, I think forgetting my birthday for 10 years was deeply unkind. Silence. My father inhaled sharply. Nathan went still. My mother pressed her lips together so tightly they almost disappeared. We are not going to rewrite history, she said. I looked around the kitchen. The light through the blinds, the fruit bowl, the same table where I had once done algebra while listening to other people's importance, fill the room around me. No, I said, we're going to stop letting you write it alone. That line hit. I knew it hit because my father looked down immediately. My mother did what she always did when accuracy cornered her. She reached for labor as moral defense. You have no idea what I carried in those years. She said, your father was traveling. Nathan needed constant support. Church obligations, family obligations, bills, everything fell on me. There are moments when another person finally hands you the blade they've been using on you for years without realizing it. I said, calmly. And somehow all of that still left room for Nathan's birthday. And Christmas stockings. And teacher gifts. And church fundraisers. And potluck sign-up sheets. And every anniversary card you ever sent. So this was never about memory. It was about value. That was the first time in my life I saw my mother have no immediate answer. Not because she understood fully, because she recognized the framing was no longer hers. My father said my name. Softly. The old warning. I turned toward him. No, you don't get to soften this. He shut his mouth. Good. Then Nathan did something I did not expect. He said, quietly, she's right. We all looked at him. Even my mother. He kept his eyes on the table when he spoke. I used to think it just happened. But it didn't just happen. I knew. I knew most years. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I hadn't suspected it. Because hearing a sibling admit they noticed your neglect and still accepted the architecture of it has a very particular sting. My mother turned toward him sharply. Nathan. He finally looked up. No. Mom, she's right. That crack changed the room permanently. Because once the favored child stops protecting the family fiction, hierarchy starts looking exactly like what it is. My mother's face went hard. You are both being unbelievably cruel over something no loving daughter would weaponize. There it was again. The idea that naming a wound is the cruelty, not inflicting it repeatedly. I stood. Not dramatically. Just because I understood the conversation had reached the only useful edge it was going to reach. I didn't come here for your understanding. I said, I came here so that the last version of this story in my body would be the true one. My father looked lost. What does that mean? I picked up my bag. It means you forgot. Repeatedly. It mattered. It changed my relationship to this family. And the year Mom finally remembered. I had already built a life in another country where being forgotten by you was no longer the thing that defined me. My mother opened her mouth. I raised my hand. Not rudely. Just enough. No. I said, you've had 10 years of versions. I only need one sentence now. The whole room went still. Then I said it. You were too late. That was the real ending. Not a scream. Not a collapse. Not a cinematic speech with violins and dishes rattling in the background. Just precision. You were too late. My father cried. Quietly. Of course he did. Nathan looked like a man standing in a room whose walls had shifted while he was still deciding what side he was on. And my mother looked something I had waited most of my life to see. Not ashamed. Not exactly. Smaller than certainty. She had built her whole identity around the assumption that family would always remain within the perimeter of her timing. That no matter how careless she had been, no matter how many times she had let the day pass, I would still be there when she finally decided to arrange a gesture. And now I wasn't. Not emotionally. Not geographically. Not structurally. That was what she had never planned for. I left with Daniel 10 minutes later. No hug. No promises. No fake summit scheduled for Christmas. Just sunlight. Humidity. Rental car air conditioning. And the strange internal quiet that comes when something old has finally stopped asking to be solved and started settling into fact instead. On the flight back to Amsterdam, somewhere over the Atlantic, I cried. Not because I regretted anything, because endings still hurt even when they're correct. Daniel held my hand while the cabin lights dimmed and other people slept badly in economy seats around us. The air smelled like coffee, stale blankets, and recycled air. My eyes burned. My chest felt open in a way that was almost frightening. "Are you okay?" he asked. I thought about it, then said, "I think I am now." That was true in ways I could not yet fully measure. My mother sent one email 3 weeks later. Shorter than usual. No performance. No long defense. No church language. Just, "I don't agree with everything you said. But I understand now that this affected you more deeply than I let myself believe." That was not an apology. Let's not romanticize women like my mother. But it was the first sentence she had ever written that admitted my inner life existed independently of her interpretation. I waited 4 days before responding. Then I wrote, "Thank you for saying that. If we have any future relationship, it will be built on consistency. Not one gesture. No pretending. No rewriting. No minimizing." She wrote back, "Understood." And for the first time in my life, that word felt less like surrender and more like border control. Things did not become warm after that. They became narrow. That is different. We speak a few times a year now. Brief calls. Measured emails. No forced intimacy. No emotional ambushes. No pretending those 10 years were harmless because everyone involved can now pronounce the word family in a softer tone. My father tries harder. Late, but real. He remembers my birthday now. Always early. That tells you everything. He sends flowers. Or a book. Or a message, with far too many exclamation points, like a man trying to make up a decade through punctuation. I accept it for what it is. Not repair. Effort. Nathan changed more than either of my parents did, which I still find interesting. Maybe guilt matures better in people who spent too much of their lives on the easy side of a system. He calls more often, asks better questions, tells the truth faster. We are not close in the cinematic sense, but we are no longer strangers shaped by the same house. And me? I turned 35 in Amsterdam with tulips on the table. Rain on the windows. Leah on video call insulting my haircut lovingly, and Daniel cooking dinner while pretending not to be proud of the cake he had absolutely been practicing in secret. At some point that evening, standing in my own kitchen with a glass of wine in one hand and no dread in my body at all, I realized something almost embarrassingly simple. My birthday had become mine. That should not feel revolutionary. It did. Because for years, the date had belonged more to their neglect than to my life. Now it belonged to the life itself. That is the deeper truth about stories like this. People hear the title and expect revenge to arrive as punishment. It doesn't always. Sometimes revenge is relocation. Sometimes revenge is emotional emigration. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to the people who kept proving you were not central is to build a world where they are no longer central either. My parents forgot my birthday for 10 years straight. The year they finally remembered. I had already moved to another country. People hear that and imagine the victory was in them being too late. It wasn't. The victory was that by the time they were too late, I had stopped waiting. That is what saved me. Not the email. Not the confrontation in the kitchen. Not even the satisfying precision of saying you were too late. What saved me was the life built before that moment. The routines. The city. The work. The friends. The husband who asked, "What do you want?" instead of "What do you owe?" The self who no longer measured worth by whether home ever got around to noticing. If this story stayed with you, subscribe before you go. There are more of us than anyone admits. People who were not hated dramatically, just deprioritized quietly until they started mistaking neglect for normal. People whose pain got called petty because it did not leave visible bruises. People who had to go far enough emotionally or geographically to hear their own lives again without family static underneath. And if that's you, remember this. You do not need them to remember perfectly in order to move on. You do not need a final apology speech to justify building distance. You do not owe endless access to the people who only notice your absence once it embarrasses them socially. Sometimes the strongest ending is simple. They remembered. You were already gone. And for the first time, that was not a loss. It was freedom.